All right. So again, good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for being on time. We're excited to have you all here. My name is Ann Retho. And before I introduce our speakers, as I mentioned, this is a recorded session. Also, today's session is designed to be valuable whether you're a seasoned export compliance professional or if you're just beginning to build out your company's compliance program, or if you fall anywhere in between. So we've structured the content in such a way that we hope to meet you where you are. So if a term like ECCN or Schedule B is second nature, or if you're hearing those for the first time, we hope that you will leave with something actionable. Um, the, Although the meeting is being recorded, we are not on the record from a press perspective. So I just say that so that everyone does feel comfortable asking questions. Use the Q&A, use the chat function. Please know that this session is not on the record. And if at the end we did need to turn off for any specific questions the recording, we are happy to do so. Please just feel free to message me and we can turn that off at the end. So, with all of the housekeeping out of the way, let me introduce our panel. So, first we have Tim Gilday. He will be walking us through the fundamentals of Schedule B and ECCNs. Um, we're hoping that he frames this in a way that kind of outlines why getting this right from the beginning matters and from a legal and enforcement standpoint. A bit of background on Tim. He's the co-founder of New Borders and brings 30 years of experience as an HSI special agent and capped by leadership roles at DHS, has worked a lot in data analytics, and we're excited to have you on, Tim. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
We also have Michael Ronayne, who will cover beneficial ownership. As I think everyone knows, this is a topic that's been a bit in flux with recent regulatory changes. So, Michael will walk us through some of what that means from an operational perspective. Obviously, this is a topic that remains critical for anyone doing business internationally. Michael also brings over 20 years investigating transnational criminal organizations, including serving as a unit chief of the Counterproliferation Investigations Unit at HSI. So, Michael, we're excited to have you here and to learn more from you.
Thanks, Ed.
And after Tim and Michael speak, I will be back to walk through a bit on how AI is changing classification workflows. And that will be followed by a live demo of Byte's platform, where we'll see both the concepts of beneficial ownership and export classification come alive. And with that, I think we can get right to it, and I will hand it over to Tim to walk us through ECCNs and Schedule B classifications.
Thank you, Ann. Hello, everyone. This is Tim Gilday. As Ann said, I worked in enforcement and border enforcement for 30 years and continue to work in the border space on data analytics and compliance. And just for a few minutes, we want to provide a little context of what you want to do prior to exporting your commodity or your software or your technology. We just use the general term due diligence. These are the steps you're going to take to make sure that you're in compliance with U.S. regulations for those exports. And you want to do it obviously ahead of time. So there's going to be two main systems you want to check. Maybe it's when you receive an overseas request for quote, or maybe it's an inquiry from your international sales and you want to know about exporting a commodity, but obviously it can also be software and it can be technology overseas. The first one you're going to encounter, or you should encounter, is a Schedule B. A Schedule B is a 10-digit numerical classification code used by the U.S. Census Bureau. So this was started uh, many years ago. It's based on the World Customs Organization Harmonized Tariff System. And just to simplify, if you have a commodity, and let's say you're going to ship it to Germany through France, you don't want to have to put all the information in the host country's language and provide it to the customs agencies. So after World War II, I believe it was, or maybe in the 50s, some point in the early 50s, the World Customs Organization came up with this system to assign a 10-digit code to all types of commodities. So if you're exporting furniture, or it could be produce, it could be electronics or metals, you're going to look it up in the harmonized tariff schedule, the harmonized schedule system, and find the corresponding 10-digit code. There's a basic logic to it. It works quite well. And the US has customized that for exports, and it's the Schedule B. So it's based on the harmonized tariff schedule, and it's a logical 10-digit number. You're going to put it on your electronic export information form when you go to export it, and you file that in the automated export system. And you're essentially saying, look, this is furniture going to South America, and this is the code. How many codes are there in? Are there 16,000? I can't remember for the
Somewhere around there,
harmony.
yeah.
Yeah. Now, this system is collecting the data. Typically, it's for statistical trade purposes, right? So we want to see the balance of trade between the US and Peru, what we sent them, what they sent us. So we use this harmonized tariff system, the Schedule B code, to collect, to assign a code to that data and gather that information. It also is used to report to the enforcement agency. So, in addition to the Census Bureau, Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security investigators access this data. And they're going to look at it to make sure it's appropriate, there isn't something going out illegally. So there's two basic purposes. One is for a statistical gathering by Census Bureau and for enforcement purposes by the enforcement agencies. That is essentially the Schedule B code. It's logical, it's not too difficult. You're going to use it when you export a shipment and you fill out an EEI. You will use it if your shipment requires an export license, which I'll get to in a moment, or if it's going to certain countries. Um, it's an AES filing requirement. Then you're going to put that Schedule B code in it. Separate from that is a different nomenclature, a different classification system. And that's the ECCN, the Export Control Classification Number. The ECCN is a 5-character alphanumeric code, which is found on the Commerce Control List, the CCL, and those are administered by the Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security. And that's to determine whether the commodity you're exporting is controlled for typically national security purposes or foreign policy considerations. Is it military equipment or technology or software? Is it dual use? So this is a more specific classification process. Most exports from the United States logically don't fall into that category. Most things that are exported, I believe I have a number of only 3% or less of commodities that are exported from the US fall within the Commerce Control List, right? So that's asking, hey, is your product subject to the export regulations of the United States? And is an export license required? Those are the two main nomenclatures that you're going to encounter. Um, but they are different. They do not correlate well. Okay, they don't have a one-to-one relationship. They were never developed for that purpose, right? They were developed by different agencies at different times for different purposes, right? So again, the Schedule B is used for export reporting and trade statistics, while the ECCN is used for export controls and license determinations. The Schedule B is managed by the Census Bureau and is provided to Commerce and Census at Commerce and the border enforcement agencies. The ECCN is managed by the Bureau of Industry and Security. Um, a lot of research has gone in to try to correlate the two different codes, but that's a bridge too far. They can do statistical correlation and show which Schedule B code is most likely to be associated with which ECCN, but they are truly separate. And it can cause a little confusion, but once you have some time on task, you'll be very comfortable with it. And Ann's going to run you through a software as a service tool that will show you how you can streamline that process very quickly at the end of this uh, presentation today. But just remember there's the product classification is part of an overall due diligence posture that companies want to take prior to export. So in addition to the product classification, you're going to do restricted party screening. Michael's going to talk about beneficial ownership reviews, and you want to do these risk assessments. And these are the two primary systems that you're going to encounter when you do that. And I'll just finish with this, Ann, before I take questions. I can tell you from an enforcement perspective, a lot of weight is put on whether a company exercised reasonable care in assigning these numbers. Did they really take a look and do proper due diligence before the transaction or the export occurred? So it isn't something you want to be casual with, negligent about. You want to take your time, make sure you have the right codes for the Schedule B and for the ECCN, and document that process. So if something is diverted, something ends up in the wrong place, you have that and you're ready to answer to the could be the licensing agency or the border enforcement agency, because they'll want to know, well, what happened? How did this end up in this restricted country or to these prohibited end users? And if you can go back and show them, look, here's the ECCN I selected, here's the process I went through, and the enforcement side for the regulators, they put a lot of weight that you took the necessary steps. Problems often arise when companies or individuals just ignore this, or they're sloppy and too negligent in the process. So it is to your benefit to take some time, do it correctly, and a tool like we're going to see today will make that process much more streamlined. I have time for any questions.
I think we'll do questions at the end, Tim, but I did want to follow up only because you brought it up. The idea of this correlation between, or lack thereof, of a connection between ECCNs and Schedule B. I know I'll show it later, but if you want to just touch on, I don't know if everyone's aware of that EU dual use correlation table. If you want to kind of walk through the
Sure.
methodology behind that.
Sure. So, some years back, I think probably 15 years back now, enforcement and customs and licensing organizations in the EU thought it would be a good idea to, when an exporter files their export declaration and they put in a certain uh, harmonized tariff code, again, not to confuse you, but we will refer to that in the US as a Schedule B code. They did a statistical correlation table and said, hey, 80% of the people that used this harmonized tariff code, it was they also made a declaration that it was controlled for export. So what they did basically, I've never seen it done in the US, but they took all of the Schedule Bs and correlated them all to the EU equivalent of the ECCN, and uh, it's a benefit to the exporters to be aware that there's higher risk. If you're 80% of the filers use that Schedule B and filed it as control for due use, it's just a convenience to let them know, hey, you should check to make sure your product isn't. So that's called the TARIC code, TARIC. I believe it's an acronym for tariffs. I forget it. It might be in French. And it's online. You can look it up. We've brought it into our system too, into this system you're about to show, because it provides some value. But that's the best, that's the closest they could come to kind of connecting the harmonized tariff schedule to the uh, ECCN type data.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for walking through that. I think that's always a list that, or a correlation table that people are really interested in and either didn't know existed or it's kind of hard to find. So just wanted to highlight that. So thanks so much, Tim.
You're welcome.
As I said, we will have a time for questions at the end. If you want to start entering questions now into the Q&A box or the chat, please feel free. I will pick those up towards the end of the session here. And with that, we'll shift gears a little bit from kind of this idea of classification, pre-licensing, and switch over to what's going on in the world of beneficial ownership. So with that, I will hand it over to Michael.
Thanks, Ann. I appreciate it. So I'm going to focus on the Ofac beneficial ownership rule. I know BIS published a rule last September. That rule has been suspended until November 9th of 2026. I believe this framework and guidelines published, I believe. So we'll stand by today, but today we're going to focus on the Ofac beneficial ownership rule. So basically what the rule says is that an entity is considered blocked if it is owned 50% or more directly or indirectly in the aggregate or by one or more blocked persons. And I'll get into what all that language means in a couple minutes with aggregate and direct and indirect. And it can become a little bit tricky, but one of the takeaways is essentially that you're not going to find these companies on the SDN list. So it's just straight screening the SDN list is not going to help you here. And this is a critical step in the sanctions compliance program, and it can be a little bit tricky to navigate. Just a little bit of background. The rule was published in 2008, or guidance was published in 2008. And when Ofac basically said any entity owned 50% or more by blocked persons are themselves blocked. In 2014, they expanded that rule to aggregate ownership interests, essentially meaning if one or more SDNs have ownership interests and the percentage of ownership equals 50% or more, then that entity itself is also blocked. In 2022, Ofac further clarified that ownership may be aggregated across both indirect and direct ownership through layered corporate structures. So again, as we can already see, this becomes a complicated process to navigate potentially. So in terms of screening for beneficial ownership, this should obviously be incorporated into your pre-licensing process. Your first step is to assess whether sanctioned individuals or entities have ownership interests. And in terms of your due diligence requirements, part of your, what you really want to be looking at, and kind of to piggyback off of Tim's point, you want to have all this down, documented. As an agent, I went into a number of businesses. I saw everything had everything completely tight, everything documented down to the letter of the law, to people that absolutely had no idea. And the people that had everything documented had a good, reasonable process in place, very rarely had problems. But you want to be screening against Ofac sanctions list, obviously, identifying beneficial owners, mapping the ownership structures, obtaining ownership certificates if possible. And you periodically want to rescreen as well if this is somebody that you're going to have a continued relationship with. Some of the key questions: who owns the company? Real basic, right? Who owns the parent company? Who owns the parent of the parent company? So you want to start developing that lineage and understanding who's in this chain. And bottom line is, does any person who owns 50% or more of that entity have an ownership claim to these companies? So We'll talk a little bit how ownership's calculated. The real basic, single owner, and that's basically if a sanctioned person owns 50% or more of a company, the company's blocked. Very easy. The aggregated ownership means ownership interests with multiple sanctioned persons are combined. So an example of that would be two sanctioned individuals, each own 25%. That totals 50%. The company's blocked. They don't have to be from the same sanctions program. It doesn't have to be just a Russian or Iranian. It could be a mix. It just matters that they're designated. And then the indirect ownership's traced through subsidiaries and parent companies, and that's where it's going to become a little bit more difficult. An example would be a sanctioned person owns 50% of company A. Company A owns 50% of company B. Therefore, company B is also blocked. So as you can see, as you have to navigate this process, it can certainly get tricky. Next thing I want to touch on is ownership versus control. So Ofac sees this as two different things. And the 50% rule, the beneficial ownership rule, is based solely on ownership, not on control. So there's obviously a big difference here. Ownership, think of shares, equity, voting interests, and an owner of a business. Control is more, think managerial duties in nature, the ability to appoint a director, influence management decisions, or to direct business operations. So an entity controlled by an SDN but owned less than 50% is not automatically blocked. But I will say that's where you really have to exercise caution. And Ofac even advises caution under the circumstances when dealing with these entities that are controlled. You could really find yourself in a slippery slope there. So you really, if you do find that as you go through your pre-screening process and pre-licensing process, this is really an area where you want to absolutely lock down and be certain that you have documentation and to show how you found or calculated the percentages. One thing with the Ofac rule, from a civil standpoint, this is it works off of strict liability, which basically, and all the Ofac sanctions are generally from a civil standpoint, not criminal. From a civil standpoint, operating under strict liability. I'm going to read what Ofac published. I'm not an attorney, so I want to make sure this is very specific. This means that a U.S. person or company can be held civilly liable for dealing with a blocked entity, even if they did not know the entity was blocked or owned 50% or more by sanctioned persons. Ofac does not need to prove intent, knowledge, recklessness, or negligence to establish a civil violation. So this is a very different standard from a criminal violation. Criminal violations do exist under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and we'll talk about that in a second, but you don't need to prove intent here. So enforcement only requires the proof that a prohibited transaction involving a blocked party, did occur. So investigators, what we would look at is were adequate sanctions controls in place, and whether the due diligence efforts were reasonable, as Tim said. It's a critical question, and it's always gonna boil down to, was there a reasonable process in place, and can you show us that? Can you provide documentation? Can you show exactly what you did, how you did it, why you did it, when you did it? In terms of just, I'll speak very briefly as I close out on the criminal aspect of this. As the U.S. government, as agents, and prosecutors, they're not looking to prosecute mistakes. However, you cannot be willfully blind to a situation. You can't say, "Hey, look, I didn't know I had to do this." There's a lot of things that go into the investigative efforts, and it's critical that. And it's critical that you have a strong process in place. Now, criminal liability involves knowledge and intent. And as I said, like most Ofac sanctions, they are charged under IEPA, including the 50% rule. Criminal penalties can be quite severe. And when you're talking about violations of IEPA, this could be up to $1 million per violation, up to 20 years imprisonment, corporate criminal liability, and it can also lead to additional civil penalties or even further enforcement actions down the road, depending on what was found during the investigation. So just to wrap it up, when you're looking at OFAC beneficial ownership, screening against the SDN list obviously is insufficient. These companies are not going to reside there. Organizations have to identify and evaluate beneficial ownership and corporate ownership claims. And these are major compliance risks when you look at it. That's a tricky process and complex and difficult at times to navigate. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll give it back to you. You're muted, Ann.
I was speaking very wisely. So yeah, I said thank you, Michael.
Sure.
One thing I just wanted to highlight here too is I know the BIS affiliates rule has gotten a lot of attention. We've done a few webinars on it. Um, Even though it was suspended last November, it is set apparently to go into effect this fall. Whether it does or not, what Mike just went through on the OFAC, like that is actively in place, and I think oftentimes has gotten a little bit forgotten. So we just wanted to bring that up, highlight that, and make sure that we all had a refresher on that OFAC 50% rule. So thanks, Mike. I really appreciate what you had to say. Um, so yeah, I also just as I jump into kind of the AI and automation in this process, some people might be wondering why we paired these two topics. One's, on the product and one's on an entity. And really we did it for two reasons. One, because these are two areas that we're seeing AI really be able to help improve efficiencies and workflows on these two categories. And then, of course, also the name of the webinar, automating pre-licensing. If you do have a pre-licensing workflow, obviously understanding what you're shipping and who you're shipping it to is kind of a baseline there. So pairing these two topics, we may jump back and forth a little bit between them as we get into this, but just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork there. So on the classification piece, going back to what Tim just said, what we're obviously all of you are experts or you're getting into this and you've faced issues with classification. It's time consuming, it's highly technical, and as we've heard, the consequences of getting it wrong are high. And so for many companies, we still hear that this is a largely manual process, a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of email threads, a lot of getting an engineer in with a trade compliance person and coordinating all of that. And so where we're seeing AI really add value on the classification piece is not that AI is replacing expert judgment. So an export control officer who's been doing this for 20 years, great insight, great knowledge. But what AI does is it can dramatically accelerate kind of the beginning of the classification process. So we can take a product description with user input, generate candidate ECCNs that quickly allow you to review those. And I'll show you how we're doing that in Byte. We can quickly surface relevant commerce control list categories or parameters so that you can go to your engineers and make informed determinations throughout the process rather than starting from scratch with no knowledge of even what questions to ask. And then finally, capturing all of this in a documented, auditable record. And as Mike said, and I think Tim said also, that's what investigators and regulators want to see, that you've done your due diligence and AI can help with that process. So at Byte, for anyone who's ever spoken with us before, you'll know our approach to AI is keeping a human in the loop. So again, not aiming to replace any experts, but more proposing likely ECCNs based on your product data, for example, or on the ownership side, presenting possible owners or owners, but not necessarily their ownership percentage, but kind of pointing you in a direction that says this is a high risk, or this is someone you should look into deeper, or this is a product that you might want to understand the technical specifications of in more detail so that you can make an informed decision. So all of that just kind of a starting point for how we at Byte are implementing AI into automated workflows. And with that, I'm going to jump in and share a live demo of the platform. We will walk through both a complete export workflow end to end, and I'll try to highlight how we've seen some compliance officers or export officers using the tool. And then we'll also look at our newly redesigned entity screening. So if you have already seen Byte's entity screening, we recently launched a version 2.0 that incorporates beneficial ownership into the entity screening. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Okay. All right. So jumping in, we'll start with the entity screening, newly redesigned. So what we have now, again, you can put in the entity name here, and we've added a few pieces. So in addition to an AI evaluation, you can also check adverse media directly from the platform, as well as beneficial ownership. So I will put in this entity and press enter. And I get an overall risk evaluation here. So you can see that my entity is high. It's matching on BIS. So obviously that in itself is high. From there, you can view a longer AI evaluation, check adverse media, and it goes out, like I said, to the internet and pulls back articles that may be additional information as you build out your risk profile here on this entity. It gives a summary of what it's found in the links as well. And then finally, ownership records. So if I scroll down a bit further, I still get my screening matches just like Byte has always offered. That's what the AI summary is basing its evaluation on. So I can see here it's hitting on multiple, it's US restricted parties, BIS, as it shows, also the section 1260H entities. But if I toggle over here to ownership, and click there, I can start to see additional entities that are owned or have some association with this entity itself. So if I open up, let's say, Global Village Associates, um, we can see here that it's on this sanctions affiliated entities, and Global Village Associates itself is controlled by this individual who's the chairman of CEO of this entity. So again, like I said, we're not saying that you can't do business with Global Village Associates, but it is an indicator if you screen them and you find that they are related to this entity, which is on BIS, we can tell right here, then you can do a bit more due diligence into the entity. With this list, this sanctions affiliated entities, we strive as much as possible to provide the links to the sources of information. So we don't want to just flag something and tell you good luck. So you can always open up these articles. There are links out to business registries, and that way you can start to follow the money, follow the information, and try to make sense of the ownership structure of your entity. So that's the newly redesigned entity screening. Again, same features as always. You can pick and choose what lists you're screening against. If you only want to screen against US, you can do that. But all of that beneficial ownership data is available here. And then you can also have an AI evaluation of the returns come back as well. This is on the entity screening. The other tool that I think a lot of people have shown great interest in is you can do all of the ownership work in our database as well. But I think additionally, when the affiliates rule was announced last fall, a lot of people started gathering ownership records from their trade partners. So you can ask your trade partner, who owns you, and that you can add that. So in the Byte database, in addition to being able to do all the same ownership functions, you can also add relationships between your entities. So you can add a new director, chairperson, employee, and you can keep this up to date so that then these entities are connected and you can see the hierarchy. Then you can click on that next entity and see the results there as well. So again, just another layer of you tracking and keeping record of the entities within your supply chains that have connections and being able to track that here. Also keeping all of your ownership information screened. Um, we talked about the Ofac 50%. There are new entities being added to Ofac weekly. Still, same with BIS. So keeping your owners in a database that's keeping them screened goes a long way around doing due diligence around ownership. Michael or Tim, anything you want to add on the beneficial ownership side now that I've walked through a bit in Byte?
And just one thing I would add is looking at the tool and how it operates. I think, coming at it from an enforcement perspective, number one, the ability for a company to do something like this is great, but more importantly, from the enforcement side, if there was ever an issue with an export or any type of shipment, it would be really good for a company to have the ability to document everything they did in terms of the beneficial ownership and be able to show that to an investigator. And I think that goes a long way toward taking away the intent aspect of uh, any sort of criminal charge. So I think having the ability to do this is phenomenal.
I would add to that, Ann, to bring all these different checks into one screen, one platform is very efficient. So there's not a lot of time and effort on behalf of the exporter. And as Michael said, when you show that you exceed really a reasonable care standard for due diligence, it goes in your favor. And you can document that and show it at the time of inquiry. That is terrific.
Great. Thank you both. And one thing I did forget to mention on this entity screening. So if you do screen an entity here, you can always save this. So even if you aren't using the Byte database, if you just come in and screen an entity, you can save those results, again, for your audit trail, for your due diligence. And you can set that up for rescreening as well. So if you screen someone who calls on the phone, set them up for rescreening. If they are added to a list, then, or there's new ownership records, anything that changes on these returns down below, you get a notification letting you know that there's a change. So even if you don't have them in a database, as long as you've screened them and set it up to save, you can continue tracking and monitoring that entity or individual. All right, and with that, I'll transition a little bit over to the classification workflow piece. And this is newly launched at Byte, and it takes you through the process of a Schedule B or HTS. Well, it's Schedule B in this case, classification. If you have an HTS code, I'll explain how that works. And then we do a general country screening, a sensitive tech, and then works through NRC, ITAR, and EAR. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a product description here, which is I would like to export a hybrid vertical takeoff and landing fixed wing UAS with a maximum takeoff weight of 20 kgs to China to be used at a university for research by engineering students on how to design UASs. So again, you can put in something as detailed as that. You can put in something a little bit vague. It'll just impact how many follow-up questions you have throughout the process. So the first question here is, do you have a 10-digit Schedule B or HTS code? So if you already have that, you can kind of move through this process a little bit faster. In this case, I'll say I do not have a code. One thing to note on this section here is if you put in an HTS that is not valid for export, if it's on that list of AES codes not eligible for export, it will work through the process of saying, okay, you put in this HTS, it's not valid for export. Let's figure out what the correct Schedule B code is based on that. So mine is a fixed wing airplane, so I'll go ahead and do that. And you can see I get the HTS or Schedule B code right here. We got a check mark over here. We've moved past this step and we are on to country screening. This country screening is pre-licensing. So what this is it's just looking at the country. Is it in a BIS embargoed country? Are there Ofac sanctions programs on the country, or is it a Russian or Belarusian transshipment point? So this will output yeses and nos there, and again, just begins to build out the overall risk profile of this transaction. So in this case, we've got a no, yes, there are Ofac sanctions, and yes, it's a transshipment point. Next, I'm going to, it says sensitive tech jurisdictions. It's a screen using the HTS or Schedule B, screening against lists that publish those. So examples being the common high priority battlefield list. So these are goods that are showing up on the battlefield in Ukraine. We also have drone technology lists, and then finally the TARIC that Tim mentioned, that's the HS correlation to dual use from the EU. So this is just flagging that there are potential ECCNs. It's also flagging on a Russian industry sector sanctions. So although none of these items are controlled or restricted on HS code to China, it's flagged as a medium risk because it is dual use. It's going to a transshipment point, and there are controls on these products going to Russia. Next, we'll go to an NRC check. With these next three steps here, NRC, ITAR, and EAR, if I hit on NRC, it'll stop there and it won't keep going. So just to say here, we have no clear match. It walks through the reasoning why. It doesn't appear to match anything on the Part 110 controls. So I will then move on to ITAR. And again, it will output its findings. And we have no clear ITAR USML match based on the information that I've provided so far. And so then finally, it will move into EAR. So the EAR review starts here with a question. Do you know whether the item or any part of or component was specially designed or modified for a specific end item defense or military application, spacecraft, or other controlled system. So if you know if it's specially designed, obviously here you want to say like yes or no. But again, just you can also say I don't know. Um, and it goes through a 7-step process here that takes a couple minutes. But like I said at the beginning, you know, we don't want to make any assumptions when working through these classifications. We really rely on interacting with the user in order to get all of the specifications. One thing to be clear on here, we don't want anyone putting in any controlled information or data. We do have an updated disclaimer coming out. So definitely don't, this is meant for information that you would use, let's say, on like a sales call or any detail that is not controlled for export. So what's the exact maximum endurance flight time? I'll say 1 hour. So when we get to step 4, um, this is where the system itself has presented those candidate ECCNs, like I mentioned at the beginning. And so it's presented itself with 4, 5, 6, depending on how many, and it's going to ask some more specification or parameter type questions to narrow down and get down to that last appropriate ECCN. So you'll see step 4 can sometimes repeat itself a few times while it narrows down the candidate ECCNs. It's preparing my question. Is the UAS designed to take off and have stable controlled flight and wind gusts equal to or exceeding 46.3 kilometers? We'll say yes. And this is where kind of working with your engineering team, if you have one, can be helpful. We're designed for aerosol dispensing. No. Um, so yeah, you can kind of start to understand like what the barrier or what the kind of parameter cap is before you get more controlled or bump up an ECCN category. And I do want to leave time for questions, so I may show you just the output really quickly while it keeps coming up with more questions for me on this example. Let me hop over to my saved work. I have done this example before. So if I open this up here, this is the final output when you save it from your workflow. So you see the chat summary. So all the questions that you answer, you can see them here in this section. And then you get your Schedule B, your same country screening. You can open each one of these up and see the hits and the returns there. I have no clear match on NRC, ITAR, and then the output from that 7-step process is this ECCN. So in this case, my fixed wing UAS would be most likely classified under this code. It's a non-military UAV with an endurance of less than or equal to greater than or equal to 1 hour, subject to EAR and license required for China. So we get a reasoning here, and then the license requirement. So exceptions are extremely limited, and user screening being mandatory, a scope and order of review. And then each of these steps here, it does the 9515 and 600 series review. And then here is where it shows you your candidate ECCNs. So these are the ECCNs it considered, and then it goes through why it was included or not, why we got to this final code, Similarly, does a license review, talks through any potential exceptions, if there are any, and then finally does an end use review. So in this case, mine was going to a Chinese university. The system here is flagging that one, China is high risk for diversion, and two, many Chinese universities are on the entity list or MEU list. So in addition to your entity screening, obviously you want to do a little bit more due diligence just around your end user. So all of this is saved in the platform. Again, for your due diligence, it's, you have record now of how you got to your ECCN, how you determined kind of what you were doing with that. You can also upload additional documents to support your decision making. You can always track your activity and then add comments as well. So as a team, you can leave comments on what that looks like. And in a short while, I won't put a time frame on it yet, even though I said we were off the record. This will also feed into an export product database. So then you have all of this in a product database that you can track those codes. But we'll do another webinar on that process in the future. Tim and Mike, I'll open it up to you for a few minutes, just if you have any comments on the classification piece here.
Thank you, Ann. Michael and I, we've been involved in border enforcement for a long time, and also in the compliance side from the private sector perspective. And over the years, I've talked to government agencies and companies and different stakeholders, and you've heard people say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had a tool that could help us with the classification, or help us do denied party screening, help us to determine whether it's controlled for export. And what Ann just walked through, it is now here. It's a major milestone. Obviously, it's enabled by the enhancements, the advancements of AI. We spent a lot of time testing this and stress testing it and try to trip it up, and it is remarkably accurate. So it's only going to get better, and you see exponentially every 6 months or so how much AI has improved, and that trend's going that's just going to continue on. More capabilities, higher accuracy, quicker time to answer. You're going to see all this. It's coming right down the road, but really we'll be at a point that you know you will just easily seamlessly transition this into your compliance procedures, and it's a great time saver, and it's really interesting to see this rolled out.
Thanks, Tim. Just taking a look here at the Q&A. Um, it looks like, oh, sorry about that. All right, so Tim, one question I have, well, Tim and Mike, what what's like the most common mistake you see when companies are first building out an export compliance program, or when you've gone somewhere? What's kind of the most common mistake you find?
Well, it always starts from the top down. So you need a commitment from management that it's an important part of their company's uh, philosophy, how they do business. So once you have that, everything else is just kind of like clearance points that you have to get through. But if you have top, leadership buy-in, it's going to make everything easier for the organization. And I just like to emphasize, compliance often is referred to as sunk costs, right? So it's not necessarily contributing to the bottom line, but it has a lot of adverse impact if it's ignored, right? So the tools we see, the solutions we're talking about to be compliant, the costs are going down, their time to perform those functions is getting shorter and shorter. So compliance is no longer a burden, right? So what you want to do is one, get buy-in from the company, kind of show people if they aren't seeing it already, how it can be detrimental to your operations, your reputation, et cetera, and then implement an export control plan using tools like this. And if you look up the commerce regs as to what is a good ECP export compliance program, you'll see using software tools is listed on that as one of the components. It's not the only component, but I guess one of the most common things is, just to summarize, is when the company itself, when you have one compliance person just running around trying to do all this like a one-armed paper hanger, it's very difficult. But if you get that buy-in from the organization, it's going to make everything go a lot smoother.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Um, I don't see any other questions coming in right now, and we are coming up on the hour here. So just a few key takeaways. I would say from both Mike and Tim, what I heard was documenting how you got to your answer is key. It's not just about getting it right. Regulators and investigators and anyone in enforcement may not be expecting perfection, but understanding that you have a documented good faith process on both classification and entity screening goes a long way. So here at Byte, we've built tools to make that documentation automatic, consistent, defensible, and as I mentioned, building in AI so that you can do all of that faster and more automated. So with that, just want to say thank you, Tim and Mike, for offering your expertise today and for your time. And to everyone that joined, thank you for taking time out of your day. If you want to get in touch with Tim or Mike, we can share their email addresses. You can always email me. We can put you in touch. And if you want more of a personalized demo or you want to start running any of your products through the export workflow, happy to do that with you on a one-on-one call. We will send out a recording and links to other resources before the end of the week. And if you do have any questions that didn't make it into the Q&A today, please feel free to send an email and we will respond. Mike or Tim, any final closing thoughts here?
Nothing for me, Ann. Thank you. I'll leave it
No,
for Tim.
and just if you do have any questions or anything that Mike and I can help out, we take those types of requests frequently and we're available. So please email Ann. We're always interested in these topics.
Great. Thank you both, and thank you all again for joining, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.